Good morning, friends. This is UGC CEC Education Network, and we hold a series under this program, and the series is titled Indian Writing in English. And today we have Professor Richa Bajaj from Delhi University to give us a lecture on contemporary women's poetry. And Richa Bajaj has written articles, papers, and published a book, and she is well versed in the contemporary poetry, apart from having familiarity with writing in English in general. So with these words, I request her to give her lecture, and she has to tell us, for instance, I'm curious to know how women distinctly hold their presence in the contemporary literary scene, and she'll be talking about this generally. So I request Professor Bajaj, welcome Professor Bajaj, and please give your lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Anand Prakash. Viewers, a very warm welcome. Today is Women's Day, and what better way to start Women's Day than talk about contemporary women writers and their poetry and their relevance in our time today. So today I'm going to discuss with you the contemporary Indian women poets in English, and I'm going to take into my discussion three major poets of the post-independence period. One is Kamala Das, then I'll discuss Eunice D'Souza, and going on to Imtiaz Dharkar. These three women poets, I find them very relevant, in the post-independence period, how they deal with language, with sexuality, with love, with marriage. They are very strong voices of, women voices in the post-independence period. And, they have a lot to tell us about our own lives and the kind of problems women face in contemporary society, in our contemporary society. So, I will begin first with the issues that are there in Indian women poets who write in English, and then go on to talk about individual poets and take some excerpts from their poems. So, that's the plan of the lecture. So, let's begin. Let's see what contemporary Indian women poets, what are the issues that they deal with. So, the concerns of Indian women poets writing in English. The first concern I find very important in their works is, the liberation of the body. The liberation of the body, means that the body is set free in their, poems. A woman's body is generally looked as an object of possession. Whose possession is she? We'll look at that. A woman's body is also looked at as a site of conflict, and, where men are, fighting over woman's body. Then there is the second issue that we'll look at, that will be related to mind and body. So, mind and body, the women's mind and women's body, are they in sync? Are they one? Are they different? Is there a conflict between the two? So, these are the questions that we'll look at when we are looking at mind and body. Then there will be a critique of social conditions that we will find in their works. Social conditions and also social conditioning during their formative years is what we would look at. There is also a very scathing attack of the institution of marriage and how marriage is used to, crush women or to subsume them entirely, in its fold. So, those are the issues. Then there will be the question of self, the question of identity, crafting oneself, reclaiming it, and reclaiming a space for the self from where the self can intervene in social processes. So, the question of self basically. Then there will be the question of female sexuality, which is a social construct. Is it a social construct? That is the question, or is it natural? Then a sexuality that is curbed, controlled, and yet assertive. So, that's the kind of, that's something we will look at. Silences, conformity, passive acceptance, and complaints, attacks, demand for freedom. You see, these are, these are the basic outlining, I've outlined somehow, some of the features that we find in their writing. So, I will, let's begin with the first, and post that I will come to the question of language also, which is a very important theme in Indian English poets in writing in English. but that I'll come to later. To begin with, when we think of the body, a woman's body, whose possession is it? Does the woman have right over her body? Or is it that, that her body is not her own, in fact, that it belongs to patriarchy, it belongs to the males, the world that she inhabits, the male world that she inhabits. Her body is, is seen as, a kind of either a childbearing machine, or it is seen as, an object of desire. So in both cases, the body is seen as a kind of an object. It is seen not as, the body is seen as something to be consumed. It is seen as something to be consumed by the male. It has nothing to do, there is no sense of soul, or there is no sense of a human being involved there. When we are speaking of a woman's body, then from the viewpoint of patriarchy or the male view, we find that the woman's body is in fact looked at, as, in very animalistic terms, or it is looked at, any object, but it is never given the right of a human being. That she thinks, she feels, that she has, she has emotions. All those categories are taken away or deliberately sidelined in the male-centered or the male-dominated world that we inhabit. So, the second point is related to the woman's body, and I will come to woman's body when I discuss Imtiaz Dharkar particularly, because there, she calls the body a sack. And and she describes it in such a way that you will understand what I am saying right now. The second point I come to is the woman's body as a site of conflict. Now, when we are discussing site of conflict, what do we mean? That she is in this tug of war between men. She is in the tug of war when there are two communities fight, then the obvious victim becomes a woman. If they have to fight and if they have to take revenge on the other community, so the woman would be taken and would be, violated. The woman would be killed, and, she would be raped. So, all those, then it becomes a kind of the woman attacking the woman, and, capturing the woman's body becomes a symbol of capturing, as if the honor or, of the other community. So, whenever there is, there is any kind of tussle between communities, the woman becomes an obvious victim. So, her body becomes the site of conflict between males, between communities, between nations. We saw in the case of India and Pakistan. We saw that women were, captured from both sides, and they were taken in, and that somehow meant that you had captured the Muslim community by capturing a Muslim woman, or you had captured the Hindu community, and you had violated the community. She becomes somehow the symbol of the community, and in that sense, her body becomes the site of conflict. People fight for it, people want to capture it, they want to use it, misuse it, throw it, kill it as they like it. So, and here people of course refers to the men, in general. So, that is, the idea of the body, that, as something that does not belong to the woman, and she's, it's completely kept away from the mind. Now, in the case of these three women, the mind and the body, works very interestingly. In the case of Kamala Das, the mind and the body, in fact, are constantly at loggerheads. She is unable to find, a kind of a resolution between the two. And for her, there is the mind says one thing and the body speaks another. But so should she listen to the body or should she listen to the mind? In fact, there's one poem which I will mention, where she mentions about the soul and the body. And she tells the sea, which one would you have? Would you have my soul or would you have my body? So, there are two categories in Kamala Das. Whereas when we come to Imtiaz Dharkar, the mind and the body are one. They are, in fact, the body speaks as much as the mind speaks. In Dharkar, you find that the body, the tongue has a very important role to play. It speaks, which women are never allowed to do. Women are always supposed to be silent in the Indian patriarchal system. They are never supposed to voice their opinion. They are shut up. They are asked to leave the place where there is anything about heady viewpoints being given. So, you see, the tongue becomes a very important symbol in Imtiaz Dharkar. And, for her, the body also is a thinking subject as much as the mind is. If the mind thinks and speaks, the body also has its own language of thinking, speaking and reacting to circumstances. So, you see these two different kinds of viewpoints in the two poets that I have mentioned. Now, coming to the critique of social conditioning, you know, as we find in their works, all three poets, you know, offer a very sharp critique of the society that they inhabit. In the case of Kamala Das, she is talking about a very, you know, she's talking about the patriarchal society. She comes from Kerala, of course, so there is this kind of matrilineal society she is a part of, and you know, so she has very strong ideas, but the society that she becomes a part of later on in life, it does not accept her. So you see, she offers a very strong critique of the system that asks her to be a wife, asks her to be a woman, you know, and you know, so she you know, she goes into systematically into the various you know, forms in which patriarchy works in society, and she you know, offers a critique of each of these different forms, that cultural practices that are there. As we come to Eunice D'Souza, you know, the social critique becomes very pungent, because you know, she's targeting in her own way, she's targeting the Goan Catholic community, you know, and you know, she's talking about the religious conservatism that exists, you know, among the Catholics, and you know, there is a sharp critique of church, sharp critique of this marriage, the Catholic family that she talks about. So you know, these are all, you know, come under target when these women talk. When we come to Dharkar, we find that the Muslim community is completely you know, she you know, critiques it, and she is able to, you know, there are potshots at this Muslim community who tries to, you know, marry off young women to older men without giving them any kind of rights, and without giving them any kind of freedom or liberty, you know, and also, you know, asking them to be in parda, asking them to take the burqa or you know, other forms of other rituals and other practices. So these religious practices in fact go on to make you know, a very conformed subject. And here Dharkar presents an alternate view. She tries to rebuke this and reject this kind of a system. So social critique is very strong in the post-independence writing of these young women, you know, writing in English. As we come to the institution of marriage, you know, marriage is of course a part of patriarchy. Marriage also gets related to the religious institutions and other cultural practices that are there. We find that, you know, one, in the case of Kamala Das, she is unable to find love in marriage. And you know, her tussle with finding love, in search of love, is something that makes her, you know, reject the, you know, marital structure also. In the case of, you know, D'Souza, she has outrightly rejected, and you know, she talks about the plight of being a single woman, and how she has to face, you know, the gossip aunts, as she calls them. She has to face this kind of prejudices in society, people who look down upon a single woman, somebody who doesn't have a right to live, somebody who's always frustrated. So, you know, she tries to counter these prejudices that work in society and, you know, in a way, you know, crush the feminine subject. So, in her poem, you actually see there may be love, there may be desire, but there is a strong critique of marriage. As we come to Dharkar, again, Dharkar talks about all the women that she has met, and the kind of, you know, they have annually born babies, she says, you know, every year they are bearing babies, and by the end they are left haggard and tired. So, you know, marriage also, you know, it in many ways, you know, it's like undoing the woman. You know, she's taking away her strength, her bodily strength, her mental strength, and you know, making her a very you know, a useless you know, subject who's able to you know, otherwise who could use one's energies and one's thought in you know, more productive ways. So, you know, marriage is looked at very skeptically, cynically, and also definitely it's not something to be desired in either of the women that we will study. As we come to the issue of self and identity, you know, the self and identity, I spoke about crafting oneself, and you know, the self, that is, when we say crafting oneself, what do we really mean? You know, that you are making yourself, you are trying to build a self for yourself, you know, for your own person. So, the question of self and identity is important in these poets, and No, I mean, they look like very cliched words sometimes, that, you know, oh, the question of self or the question of identity. Everybody is talking about identity, origin, and post-colonial. That is the mainstay of post-colonial writing, that everybody talks about identity. So what is so special about a woman's identity? Now, a woman's identity is different and is special because, you know, unless she creates an identity of who she is, the world is trying to make the woman believe that she is nothing other than a mother or a daughter or a sister. There are always roles that you have to play. There are always so your own subjectivity. Who's this I? Is there an I of a woman? Does she have an identity outside her motherhood, her sisterhood, or being a daughter? You know, does she have an identity without a male? That is the question. You know, and that is why I say the identity of a woman subject is very important, because she must create for herself her own sensibility, her own identity, which doesn't have to relate to any relationship, which doesn't have to relate to any male figure. Unless she carves a self out for herself, or as I say, crafts a self, that is, she creates it for herself, you know, and that has to happen through self-analysis, questioning the basic given facts of life, questioning what is always believed to be true, questioning tradition, conventions, rituals which women just follow because they are asked to follow, you know, questioning the education that they are given, the very family system that tells them then how to be better wives, how to be better women, how to cook well, how to drape a sari well, all those questions, you know, questioning why they are being asked to learn those and not learn politics, not learn science, not learn history. Why? You know, so not go too much into literature. So, you know, these are the questions that, so mind is somehow kept outside the terrain of a woman. You know, she can be associated with emotion, experience, but never with the mind, never with the thinking subject. And this is when I say these women, this is how these women play a role in our lives, because they make us realize, they shake us from our complacency, you know, that, it's time that you think about your own self. You think about who you are and make your own identity based on, your experiences, and question everything around yourself. And you know, their view, so their view is non-conformist, and question, and you don't have to conform to everything that you are asked to conform to. So, you know, these are you know, the issues that these writers, these poets bring to us, and make the exercise useful for us. So, you know, they try to reclaim a space for their own selves. They try to reclaim their own selves. When I say reclaim, it means that somebody has already laid claim over you, and now you need to reclaim yourself that has been taken away from you. From birth, when you were born, afterwards, as you grew up, you know, Simone de Beauvoir says that one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. So you're born a human being. But as you grow up in your formative years, you're asked, you know, your social conditionings are done in such a manner that you are made to believe that you are a woman. So you're weak. Women need less food, men need more, so they are not fed well. Women are weak in strength, and men are, have all the strength. So all these notions, you know, of the weak subjectivity, all these are taught to us in our formative years. And it is time that, so that means that a mindset, you know, the patriarchal mindset has claimed our mind and ourself. And now is the time, as these poets tell us, now is the time that we need to reclaim it. Get it back for yourself and reclaim a space for yourself, not just yourself, but a space within which you can work, a space within which you can, counter, attack, whatever you wish to do, you are able to do. So that is reclaiming, and not just so reclaiming, and also intervening in social processes. There are two different words. One is that first you reclaim yourself, and then you intervene in social processes. When I say intervene, what do I mean? I mean that you make, you work towards some kind of change. You change the structure of things. You change the way of thinking. And this is precisely what these poets are doing here for us. When you read Imtiaz Dharkar, when you read Kamala Das, you're, so to speak, in a way, you're awakened. Your sensibilities are awakened. You realize that what you had just been taking for granted is not something that, is natural. It is something that is social, that is a social construct. So, you know, they make you aware, and that is what intervening is here. So they in their own ways have been intervening in the social processes and have tried to create a sensibility that people can understand, people can relate to, and you know, they would follow and then further the cause. So which is why that is what I mean by intervening. Female sexuality, you know, female sexuality, is it a social conduct? Is it a social construct? I'd actually like to ask, you know, our coordinator here, what does he think of before I have any view, I bring in any view. I'd like to ask what he thinks of female sexuality. Is it a social construct? Yes, Dr. Anand Prakash, what would you say?
It's a difficult question to ask from me, and I wish you had first given your opinion, but since you asked me, so I would say that a woman is to be considered, as you have already argued quite well, as a person and as a citizen in the country. And as citizens, you know, we have the constitutional right to behave the way we have to. And then there is a democracy and there are certain values, and women are equal, are supposed to be equal. In that case, female sexuality has to be with a kind of behavior that is rooted in one's body, as you rightly suggested. And if there are certain terms and conditions that society follows, then those terms and conditions should apply to both men and women equally. So, a woman has emotions, a woman has feelings, a woman has ideas, as you rightly say, a woman has a right to herself, her identity, all these things are there. In that case, because she has a body, and you referred to Simone de Beauvoir, she also explains it quite well, you know, that there are certain bodily functions, that there are emotions, and those emotions and bodily functions are to be looked at from the point of view of the citizen in society. We all have the right to assert ourselves, assert our opinion, and assert our bodies. So, because bodies belong to human beings generally, and in the case of women, to them specifically, therefore, a woman has, you know, that kind of a role to play in society vis-a-vis her body. So, this sexuality cannot be separated from a woman, it cannot be separated from a man, and as an integral part of one's personality, I think sexuality has to show this kind of presence. What do you say?
Yes, you know, that is why I thought that, you know, it will be, you know, this female sexuality is of course a part of a woman's self. You know, it's not something that can be distinguished. It's not that sexuality can be kept out of purview. In fact, what I'm trying to say is that female sexuality is a social construct. It is natural, of course, because it is a part of the self. It is the part of the self of the woman, just as the mind is, which is the natural propensity of the mind is to think and to analyze. So there is this, there is a part of the human mind which is sexuality, where one has desires and one wishes to express them. One wishes to express what one wants. So, you know, and it could be with vis-a-vis sexuality. But why I choose to call it a social construct, the female sexuality a social construct, is because I feel that in our culture, we are, you know, we are asked to always believe in a model of sexuality. We are asked to believe that women never have sexual desires. In fact, you know, most of the men would believe that, you know, women don't have sexual desires. It is only the men. It is the domain of men. To desire is the domain of men, and, you know, to be consumed, or a woman is an item of consumption. You know, so she's not supposed to have desire. So, you know, a silenced, you know, so, you know, there is a kind of repression of the sexual desire in a woman. And that is what is taught to women, you know, throughout. They're not supposed to talk in this manner. They're not supposed to express their desire. They're not supposed to woo men. They're not supposed to, you know, they're supposed to be shy. You see, so shyness is considered an essential quality of female sexuality, which would perhaps tease the man more. And the more she shies, the you know, the better it is considered in the male you know, view of sexuality. So the female sexuality is constructed for us to believe in. It's not something that we believe in, but it is constructed for us to believe in. That this is what female sexuality is, and this is how you feel. You should feel. And if you don't feel this way, then you should certainly adhere to the norm. Now, this is what Kamala Das totally explodes, this idea of female sexuality that is considered to be the normal view in a patriarchal society. She completely does away with, she rejects that idea, and she takes the, you know, she becomes the principal subject who will express her desire for men, for other men outside marriage also. So, you know, there is no sense of guilt, or there is little, I would say there is some sense of guilt, because she is not totally out of her own domain, and you know, she is not out of society, living out of society. There is some sense of shame attached there, and I will quote from one of the poems. But more or less, she has, you know, she is very confident, she is bold in her sexual, you know, fantasies, in the desires that she has. So all these are, you know, inbuilt in her works, and you know, so female sexuality is given a complete turn in her poems. Even her projections, everything, whether even when she's projecting nature, or you know, a season, or summer, everything gets related to the question of sexuality in Kamala Das, which is why I opened this question of whether female sexuality is to be seen as a social construct. So this is the basic point that you know, I wanted to speak to you about the issues. Other than that, you know, of course, there are, on the one hand, there are silences and conformities that are there, silences of older generation of women, and on the other hand, this new generation of women which we are talking about, who will attack and who will take the forefront, you know. So this is the basic, these are the basic ideas I leave you with, and in the following lecture I will take the specific cases and speak about the poets individually. Thank you. Welcome back, viewers. So we were discussing the contemporary Indian women poets in English, and I have spoken about the issues and concerns that are there in the poets. I wish to begin with the question of language, which is an important question. The question of language, that means the question of English language in the poets. Now, you will see that language can play the hegemonic role. It can be a hegemony where women feel imprisoned by the language structure, by the usages and words that are presented to them in their own language. But the language can also be used contrarily as a tool in the hands of these poets. The use of English language is actually one such tool, because the English as a language becomes the agency of the subjugated subject. The subjugated subject, the one who has been repressed, the one who has been dominated by you know, the male subjectivity. So this agency of the subjugated subject, which had been imprisoned by language at the heart of society, appears released in a strange distant tongue that is devoid of taboos and prohibitions inherent in the native cultural language. So at one level, you know, we can see that language also liberates these women subjects, you know, from their cultural, you know, from their own culture. Then the problem that occurs, you know, in their the colonial language, they are using the colonial language, but they are making this colonial language their own. So there is a sense of Indianization of English that we find in all these poets. There is they use direct speech, they use bare statements, they use colloquial usages, which all suggest that, in a way, you are actually reading an Indian text and not an English text. That's the beauty of their, of their poetry, of their use of language. But at the same time, I would like to quote here from a critic, Sanjukta Das Gupta, who offers, an opinion that the post-independence Indian woman poet writing in English is in a double bind. How? Firstly, she experiences the marginality of gender, the inevitable biological construct, and the associated cultural construct. Secondly, her choice of English language for creative expression doubly marginalizes her. So that's the point. So there is a kind of double marginalization that takes place. One, because being a woman, she is marginalized, but she is looked down upon, or she is looked skeptically for using a language that has colonized us for a very long time. So using the colonizer's language, also in a way creates suspicion in the mind of the vernacular writers or readers who think that there would be some kind of an elitism and that this person is not Indian. So they have to deal with those prejudices also when they are writing in the colonizer's language. But the point is that I was trying to make earlier also, their English does not have that, does not talk about the English sense. Their English is very Indian English. They talk as if they break the structure, they shuffle the word usages here and there, so that it appears as if you're actually reading a native language, and the essence, the usage, the idioms used are very Indian in a sense. So, but they were always targeted for writing in English, and they had to face those targets. So, beginning with how Kamala Das tried to talk about how she reacted to the question of language, I'd like to quote from Kamala Das's poem. It's called An Introduction, and she says here, I don't know politics, but I know the names of those in power and can repeat them like days of week or names of months. Beginning with Nehru, I am Indian, very brown, born in Malabar. I speak 3 languages, write in 2, dream in 1. So, you see, I speak 3 languages, write in 2 and dream in 1. So, the language, in a way, they are merging. Even when she knows 3 languages, she's talking about the language of the mind. She's talking about the language of her dreams. She says, I may know 3 languages, I may speak 3 languages, I may write in 2 different languages. She's writing both in Malayalam and in English, but I dream in 1. So, the language that she dreams in becomes 1. All 3 languages, in fact, merge in that one language. Then she is talking about the views of other people who have targeted her long for using English. She says, don't write in English, they said. English is not your mother tongue. Why not leave me alone? Critics, friends, visiting cousins, every one of you. Why not let me speak in any language I like? The language I speak becomes mine. Its distortions, its queerness, all mine, mine alone. Here, of course, you see that kind of, she's making the language her own. She says, any language I speak in, I will make it mine. I will, so that language, so interestingly, it's not just the English language that she's talking about, there is also a woman's language that comes into play. So, she's using the English language, which is looked at skeptically in society. Secondly, she's using a woman's language, which also is a target by the, and she's creating a tradition for woman's language as against the male-centered language, and of course, as I said, earlier, that using the native language also has its own problems, its own prejudices. The language is, we cannot say that the language does not have shades of patriarchy, or it does not have shades of the male dominated viewpoint. It will have, the words in itself carry the prejudice against women. So she might feel constrained in the use of the native language, but by using an alien language and then trying to make it her own, she's created, so to speak, a woman's language. And here then she says, all mine, mine alone, and here then she says, it is half English, half Indian. Funny perhaps, but it is honest. It is as human as I am human. So the language is as human, and that language in her view is both Indian and English. It is half English and half Indian. It voices, she says, what does this do to her? It voices my joys, my longings, my hopes. It is useful to me as cawing is to crows or roaring to the lions, which means it is it comes naturally to her. So, because the language is not any language, the language is actually her voice. This is what she wants to, portray here, that it carries my voice, it carries my hopes and my fears, and that's how. So, language as communication, and what medium she finds best, that communicates her hopes and her desires. So then she says, is human speech the speech of the mind that is here and not there, a mind that sees and hears and is aware? So you see, it is the language of a mind that sees, that hears and is aware. What would you like to say, Dr. Anand Prakash, on the question of language?
The very idea struck me as you were quoting from Kamala Das. For instance, she has quoted two birds, a bird and an animal. The bird is the crow, yes, who calls, yes, which means talks, which means creates a kind of noise, and through noise the bird asserts itself. Then the lion, which roars.
Yes.
So women, are supposed to identify themselves with birds which talk, which speak, which make sounds. And at the same time, as lions, who will look at things alertly and then attack if there is a kind of, liberty taken from them.
Yes.
So, could you take it up as a kind of symbol that is done by choice?
Yes, I think that what you're suggesting is that they can be both violent and they can talk sense, and they can talk and roar both. So the symbols here of used of the crow and the lion, as you say, they are more in the sense of that the twin role that language plays for them. That through language they can attack, they can be violent, they can roar, but they can also talk their mind. And she says here,
the society that assigns birds to women are different kinds of birds. A woman is supposed to be a manna, a woman is supposed to sing, but in this case she has chosen very consciously the bird crow.
Yes.
So I think that is quite important and quite assertive from the woman's point of view. So I am really struck by this kind of a choice.
Yes.
And it's a choice of language.
Yes, that is true. So and it's a choice of language and of a mind that sees. She says a mind that sees and hears and is aware. Very importantly, she wants to underline these three aspects of her mind. It's not a vacant mind. It's not a mind that is not supposed to think. It is a mind that sees, that observes what is around, that hears, is very sensitive, to what is being said, and is an aware mind. I think that's what she wants to underline as against the common perception of women. And you see, again, I'd like to quote from the same poem. She says, she says, I was a child and later they told me I grew up, for I became tall, my limbs swelled and 1 or 2 places sprouted hair. When I asked for love, not knowing what else to ask for, he drew a youth of 16 into the bedroom and closed the door. He did not beat me, but my sad woman body felt so beaten. The weight of my breasts and womb crushed me. I shrank pitifully. You see the kind of violence, I felt that, there is so much of, she begins with talking about language that she's chosen, and then she's talking about her childhood. But just note how fast she has grown from the experience of childhood to adolescence to being a woman. In the first case, she says, I was a child. And then she says, they told me I grew. And then she says, and after the experience that she has with this youth of 16 and who's violent with her body, she says that he did not beat me, but I felt beaten. But my body, the woman's body, now again, from child to adolescent and to the woman's body, in 3 lines, she's actually, succinctly put her, her growing up years. That, at the end of that experience, she is left beaten. That my woman body, my sad woman body, felt so beaten, she says. So you see, this is the kind of violence that she is also referring to, and violence of being seen as an object, and not as a human being.
It's a social violence. It's a cultural violence.
Yes.
It's a violence of male against woman.
Yes.
So it's not an individual violence. This is accepted as something that is there in society all the time.
Yeah.
So I really like this kind of example that you picked up from her, and this very clearly tells us as to how society treats our women in India.
And I take this forward then, and when she talks about, she says that in reaction, she reacts to this kind of violence that is met to her on her body and on herself, and then she says that then I wore a shirt and my brother's trousers, cut my hair short and ignored my womanliness. So, that's the reaction that she takes. That's the other side that she moves to. And then what is being told to her? Dress in saris, be girl, be wife, they said. Now, interestingly, be girl, be wife, this is very Indian usage. It's not a very accepted English, the proper English that we'd call it. It's a very Indian English, be girl or be like a girl or be wife, very Indian style of writing. But to come to what she's saying, she says, dress in saris, be girl, be wife, they said. Be embroiderer, be cook, be a quarreler with the servants, fit in. Oh, belong, cried the categorizers. So women are constantly being categorized again, that these are the roles that you have been assigned to do and these are the roles you must do. Beyond that, you shouldn't. Beyond that, you shouldn't venture. So try to fit in, belong to this category of woman that has already been created for you. So the self of the poet has to really fight against these odds, has to fight against these conceptions which are available, and she has to create in this moment, she has to create for herself an alternate self. And there is, don't sit on walls or peep in through our lace draped windows. So women are girls are not supposed to sit on walls. They are supposed to be in the kitchen. You see, the space is also demarcated. Again, as we come to Dharkar, we will note how space has been demarcated in her case as well. And she goes on to talk about all these the pretending games. She says, don't play pretending games. Choose a name, a role. That is what that is what she's been asked to do. So you see, this is what I wanted you to have an understanding of, how Kamala Das is writing, and she's able to take a bold stance against these things. And then she, towards the end of the same poem, she says, she tries to define herself, and then she says, that it is I who laugh, it is I who make love and then feel shame. It is I who lie dying with a rattle in my throat. I am sinner, I am saint. I am the beloved and the betrayed. I have no joys that are not yours, no aches which are not yours. I too call myself I. So there is a kind of self-definition here. There is an emphasis on the I of the poet, the self of the poet, that she is trying to assert herself in this particular case. But interestingly, she says that, I make love and then feel shame. You see, so shame, it's even when she is trying to fight against these odds, even when she understands that these are social customs that need to be critiqued, even then there is something that has seeped in her. She is not outside society. Certain things have been rubbed off on her character. She is not somebody who is going to be revolted all out and not carry anything from the social structure. So certain things have remained in her, certain things still play a part, like shame. She would otherwise criticize shame. She
as a person might think that I am a saint, but people think I am a sinner. So she tries to combine these two, that I am a saint, I am a sinner. So for herself she might be a saint, but for people she is a sinner. And but yes, she feels the sense of shame, because that sense of shame has been instilled in her from childhood, that she must feel shame when she makes love, that she must not exert herself. So even when she is trying to counter this entire colossal system, she is at the same time drawing some things from there, and certain things are entering her system without she probably being aware of it. So that idea is also there. As I'd like to quote from another poem of Kamala Das, and that is on marriage, her critique of marriage, and what she wants to say to her husband. And she says this, the title of the poem is The Old Playhouse, and she says here, you planned to tame a swallow, the bird basically, she's referring to that. You planned to tame a swallow, to hold her in the long summer of your love, so that she would forget not the raw seasons alone and the homes left behind, but also her nature. What is the nature of the bird? It is to fly. So she says, how can you tame? You tried to tame me, and I am the bird that is meant to fly. You tried to tame me and bring me home, and you thought that I will forget everything, but that's not going to happen. So she says that you tried to tame a swallow, to hold her in the long summer of your love, so that she would forget not the raw seasons alone and the homes left behind, but also her nature, the urge to fly, and the endless pathways of the sky. It was not to gather knowledge of yet another man that I came to you, but to learn what I was, and by learning, to learn to grow. But every lesson you gave was about yourself. You were pleased with my body's response, its weather, its usual shallow convulsions. You dribbled spittle in my mouth. You poured yourself into every nook and cranny. You embalmed my poor lust with your bittersweet juices. You called me wife. I was taught to break saccharine into your tea. You note the satire here. She says that you called me wife. I was taught to break sugar into your tea, that's what saccharine into your tea, and to offer at the right moment the vitamins. Cowering beneath your monstrous ego. So she as a person, she as a woman has been cowering under the monstrous ego of the husband. I ate the magic loaf and became a dwarf. Now the idea, as we note here, became a dwarf means that she wasn't a dwarf earlier. That marriage has made her a dwarf. Marriage has belittled her significance in life. Marriage has made her believe that she's a dwarf. So there is a sense of, there is a change of perception of self also that has happened with the, the institution of marriage that has come, that is crushing this individual subject. So she has become a dwarf, the word became is important. I lost my will and reason. So she lost it, which means she had it. I had will and reason, but I lost it being in your company, and how she was made to feel in the relationship, the monstrous ego of the man, where she cowered and cowered till she was crushed. So she says, I lost my will and reason to all your questions. I mumbled incoherent replies. The summer begins to pall. I remember the rudder breezes. And then she of course goes on and she says, your room is always lit by artificial lights. Your of course is a reference to the husband here, who's the addressee. So she says, your room is always lit by artificial lights. Your windows always shut. Windows always shut refers to this sense of cage, where the bird is, taking the, the metaphor of the bird further, that she's a bird whose natural urge is to fly, but there are windows always shut and she's caged in the house. And of course, it's a rich man's house, and she says, your windows always shut. Even the air conditioner helps so little. All pervasive is the male scent of your breath. So the sense of the male scent, the presence of the male is always there. The person who holds the power and who wields power, that presence is constantly felt. So scent, obviously not just the presence of the person, physical presence, but also the scent means that it lingers, it remains in the house even when the person may not be physically present. So the scent of the male remains, that the presence and the reminder of power, the person who wields power over you is always there. The cut flowers in the vases have begun to smell of human sweat. So you see, the cut flowers are very much like the woman in this case. You know, it could be interpreted as the subject persona who's herself like cut flowers out there for decoration of the house. She is also a part of these objects that she is defining and projecting, who are meant to decorate the house and nothing else, nothing beyond that. Okay, I think so. You see, there is no more singing, no more dance. My mind is an old playhouse with all its lights put out. You know, that's, and the poem of course goes on, but I wanted to quote this passage in order to tell you her understanding of marriage, her you know, how she perceives marriage in her present case, and it is one that crushes her individual self. So you know, from here I'd like to take you know, a poem from Dharkar and a poem from D'Souza to talk about their take on you know, what is about these issues that we have discussed at length. Now, you see, when we are discussing Eunice D'Souza, you see there is this sense, D'Souza, of course, you know, the Kamala Das is, you know, the beginner of this tradition of women's writing, which is followed later by Eunice D'Souza, who's born in 1940, and she has several collections of poetry. And again, her poems are very satirical in note. You know, they are confessional in note. They are confessional poetry, and there is a sense of fierce anger and, you know, a sense of insanity, a sense of darkness in her writing, which refer to a state of crisis. You know, there are direct statements, of course, and, you know, D'Souza in her introduction to the collection of poems, A Necklace of Skulls, says that a Canadian academic told me that my poems weren't poems because they didn't have images. This worried me because I was already unsure of the rather jagged pieces I had produced when all I wanted to write were lyrical poems with soft, sensuous and passionate lines. So she wanted to write passionate poems, soft lyrical poems, but she found herself writing very direct, satirical, sharp statement like poems, and which had less images, more you know, capturing the dialogue between people, or observing what people were doing, what they said, and less you know, these kind of beautiful images that you otherwise found in poetry. So she is self-conscious, but that is precisely what marks her difference from other poets. So you see, I'd like to quote from D'Souza's two poems where there is such violent imagery, and you know, and there's a sense of macabre in fact in them, you know, and you're left shocked when you read something like this. And I'd like to quote from these two poems. I'd like to read out from them. The one is called Forgive Me, Mother. Forgive me, Mother, that I left you, a lifelong widow, old, alone. It was kill or die, and you got me anyway. The blood congeals at lover's touch, the guts dissolve in shit. I was never young, now I'm old, alone. In dreams, I hack you. Now that's such a violent image when she says, in dreams, I hack you, mother. That's what she's telling the mother, that, you know, there is so much has been inbuilt, this built up anger and frustration and this kind of agony that has made her say that in dreams she hacks her own mother. You know, and mother in this case, she sympathizes with the mother, of course, but, you know, there is this sense that the mother has, you know, has imposed, has, you know, hammered, you know, the tradition into her, and she has been made to rebel against that idea. And it's the most unnatural thing when she says that I wished in dreams I hack you. To come to, you know, the second poem that I wanted to quote from, here she says, for my father, dead young, I hold the child up in delight. The revolving fan cuts her through. It's a dream, I'm you. So you see, she says here that I hold the child up in delight. The revolving fan cuts her through. It's a dream, I'm you. So she is talking about, she's seeing herself as the father who takes the child up and the fan cuts the child. You see, so, and this is how, you know, that's the kind of pain that she wants to express, you know, in her poem. There is a sense of dread and fear. I heard your fumblings in the dark, woke on wet beds. So you see, there's this fear and dread also attached with it that is there in D'Souza's work that we find. Lastly, I'd like to quote from Imtiaz Dharkar and quote from her poem Parda. In fact, there are more lots of these poems. Let's look at the excerpt here from Dharkar's poem. This is Not a Muslim Burial. She says, afterwards, I prefer you burn my body, burn my words, and mix together all the ashes, leave them on a train traveling between. No one must claim me. On the journey, I will need no name, no nationality. So she doesn't want to be claimed by anybody. You know, she thinks that being claimed by anybody is taking away her own sense of self. She doesn't want to be claimed by the Muslim community or even being claimed by any particular nation. So that is the basic idea. One more quote I'd like to take from Dharkar, and that is, I'm letting all the bad things fall away. I am no one but myself. No one possesses me. You won't find me in Sialkot being someone's daughter. You won't find me in Lahore being someone's sister. So again, this is what she wants to say. I'm no one's, you would not find me being a daughter or a sister of somebody. Taking another quote, at last I'm taking off this coat, this black coat of a country. I'm taking off this veil, this black veil of a faith that made me faithless to myself. I'm taking off these skills, the Mangal Sutra and the rings. I'm taking off the skin, then the face, the flesh, the womb. This was from Honor Killing. The idea is that even the womb of the woman is not her own. She doesn't have, you know, right over her own self or her womb. And all these women have tried to create space for them to be able to reject all the notions that have been handed over to them over the generations. With this, I'd like to close today's lecture. Hope you've been able to make use of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Bajaj, for an excellent lecture. And in this, you have brought out the anger of women's poets and the state of society in which they are supposed to be angry. They are supposed to assert themselves. And viewers, here is a lecture which gives you a lot of food for thought. Rework your images, rework your language in the light of what Professor Bajaj has said regarding women's expression in their poetry. I hope you have really liked this lecture, and go over it again and come back with questions if there are any. Thank you.